my name is Jensen. Let's learn some UiPath. Make sure you watch the entire video today, as this will teach you one of the most important concepts of UiPath, that is the try catch activity. The try catch activity will help us handle exceptions and errors, and it will be excellent when we work with transactions. And think about the UiPath framework. We do exactly that here. That's another good reason to watch this entire video. So a try catch is very easy to understand. We try an activity. That could be, for example, a type into. We type into one of our systems, or we type into a web page. If this goes wrong, usually our robot will stop. But we can define the catch. We can do it down here in the catches. We will get back to the details down here. But this allows us to, if we have an error with one of the transactions for some kind of reason, we can catch it here. Usually we'll define the log message, and then we will move on to the next transaction. So our robot won't break and we will do great logging. Let's go through a try catch / exception use case together. Make sure to download the course materials below in the description and have UiPath open and do all the operations with me. Let's get going. Let's create a simple solution in UiPath that will illustrate how we can use a try catch. For that, you will need the Excel sheet from the course materials. Go download it from the description below. And we will need to open up the calculator on your computer. If you can't find calculator, just search for it in your local language. It will be there. That's it. Then we go to our Excel sheet that we downloaded from the course materials below. I placed mine here on the desktop. It's called data, so I'll open it. Here we have a transactions sheet. We have two columns, ID and transactions. The ID, that is just unique identifiers for that transaction, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the transactions consist of only one number, 2, 4, 6, 8. That's it. So very simple transactions with not much data. But it's great as it illustrates how we will use the try catch. So the task here is simple. We want to read this Excel sheet, and then we will just type in 2, 4, 6, 8 on our calculator. You could see this as if we typed into a system. So like this. Let's go to UiPath and create the solution and talk a lot about the try catch. So first we will need to read the Excel sheet. So find an Excel application scope and drag it in. Here you will need a workbook path. You will find that by simply go to your Excel sheet, shift right click, copy as path. Then go back to UiPath. We have the option to paste in the address here. That will work fine. But as a best practice, always create a variable. So go down to variables. I'll create an strExcelPath like this. And then here in the default value, we will paste in the address of the Excel workbook. Why do we do this? Well, we could, as I told you, have pasted in the address up here, but we won't say that we will use this address a lot. Then we will use a variable. So if, for instance, that address will change, that is this one here, say we moved it to another computer, then it will still work if we only change it here, instead of we had to change it like 10 or 20 times in our workflow. So always do that. So up here we will say strExcelPath like that. Then we will read our Excel sheet into a data table. So drag in a read range here. So where do we want to read? Our sheet was named transactions. So instead of sheet 1, we will say transactions like this. Over here, do we have headers? Yes, we had the ID and the transactions header. Then we will output it to a data table. A data table is simply just a table with rows and columns, just like your Excel sheet, but we do this because we want to work with it. So we read the Excel sheet and output it as a data table. Control K, that will create a new variable over here that will create the output variable. Then we will say dt, and then we can call it dtTransactions, like this. So now we will iterate through each row of these transactions and type it into the calculator. To do so, we will find for each row here, like this, and drag it in, still in the Excel application scope. So for each row in this data table that we created up here, that is dtTransactions, like this. What do we want to do? Well, we want to click into the calculator. So find a click like this and take this one here and drag it in here. Where do we want to click? Well, we click this indicate on screen and then just pick one of these number buttons. I pick number 2. It doesn't matter because we will make this dynamic. Now the address of this activity is fixed on the number 2. That will work if our number is 2, but it will not work with all the other transactions. It will click number 2 each of the time. So if we will fix this one, click, just number. Always rename your activities if you can, then it will make it much easier afterwards. So we will fix the address, and to do so, click the 3 ribbons here. Click edit the selector. This is a very specific selector. As you can see here, this is the number 2 button and it says name 2. We want to make it dynamic so it will work with all our transactions. So to do so, you will need to have a little knowledge about these selectors, that is just the addresses. But I know that we can delete this name 2, so do so. And over here, this is our dynamic part. So it will, if we click the number 3 button, it will say num3 button. So we mark this. So simply just mark the number, then right click. Then we will create a variable. And here we will just call this strNumber. It will be a string. Even though it's a number, it will be a string because it's used here in the address. So then we click enter. And you can see that we have made a dynamic part here. Click OK, like this. Now we just need to make the link between our data table with the transaction numbers in and this click. Because remember, we wanted, let me show the Excel sheet, we wanted to click these numbers. And we have this for each row. So we are actually iterating through each one of these rows. So we can take advantage of that. Let's go down to variables. We just created this strNumber, and as you can see, we have it as number 2 here. But we want to use the number from each one of these rows here that we are iterating through. And to do so, go down here and delete, say, row.Item, like this. That will refer to the current row.Item, that is the column. So we'll say parentheses and parentheses end. It will make that automatically. Then quotation marks like this. And then we simply just type in the name of the column. It was transactions. Transactions like this. And because it's an Excel object and we want to use it as a string, remember the address was a string. Then we'll just say toString like this. Now let's just add a simple message box to complete our workflow. So find a message box like this and drag it in. Here I'll just say robot is finished like this. Let's try to run it, but first let's reset the calculator like this and run our automation. So here we will say 2, 4, 6, 8. That's it. It worked. And we have our message box. Let me illustrate why it can be a problem. Say our application, in this case our calculator here, is shut down. Then we can't find this selector. Our robot will break. There will come an exception message on our screen. And our robot is gone. And we will not have the opportunity to finish the robot. In this case, it's just a message box, but it could be much more. So what we can do here is, before we close down the calculator and see the problem, click the click number here, go over here in properties. If you haven't got properties, it's because it looks like this. You can just click it here and make sure to pin it. But go over in target here. In the timeout milliseconds, we can just specify 2000, that is 2 seconds. It's in milliseconds. That means that it will time out after 2 seconds when it can't find this. Usually just leave it as standard, but for this example, we'll take 2 seconds. So close down the calculator and then run our automation. like this, you'll see that we have an exception here with the selector not found. That is right, because we haven't got the calculator open. But say that we want the rest of our workflow to finish. That could be the other transactions that might not have to use that application, or we simply just need this message box. It could be much more. Let's use a try catch to encounter for these errors. To do so, find a try catch activity over here and drag it in. Place it in the body in the for each row here. The try catch is very simple. There's no magic to it. It will try an activity. In our case, this will be the click, so we'll drag it in here. It will try this. And if it throws an exception like you saw before, then it will move down to catches. Here we can catch this error up here as an exception and define what we want to do. That could be that we want to send a log message and then move on to the next transaction. If there's an error here as well, we can throw an exception as well, and we can process each of these transactions. Say that each and every one of these will have an exception, then it will just log these things if we define it and move on. That's very clever. So in the catches, click the add new catch here. Here we can choose an exception. We could either be very specific. This one was a selector exception, but if we want to just catch all exceptions, we can take the System.Exception. Usually you want to work with two kinds of exceptions. That is System.Exception, as you see here, that will catch everything, and business rule exceptions. We'll get back to that. So pick the System.Exception. Then you click here, and we can see that we can have some activities here. That is, if this one will give us an exception, we go down here and we have an exception, and we can define what's going to happen instead of our robot is stopping. So find a log message like this and drag it in. Here we will have a log level, and because we cannot find the application, we will have a warn. Here we can, as we are used to, make strings or variables. We can make two quotation marks like this, and we can say an exception occurred. Try to be as specific as you can in your log messages. So we'll say an exception occurred, not very specific, and then we'll say plus, because we can get the message that is from this exception up here in the try. So we'll say plus, then we'll say exception like this, dot message. Hey friend, if this video helps you, I'll be extremely happy if you give this video a thumbs up, as this will improve my reach. Back to the video. Let me show you. So let's try to run our awesome automation once more. Now we have the try catch. Like this, our robot finished, but take a look at the log. So go down to output, and here we can see that we have this log. It is 4 log messages. We have an exception occurred. That was our message. That was this one here. And then we have the exception message. That's very clever. If we want to fix our robot at a later point, say this is running unattended over the night, we can come back the next day and fix it. As I told you, the System.Exception, that was the general one. So we could be more specific and say that we want to handle this in the right type. Then we simply just add the new catch exception here. We cannot find a selector not found, so go down to browse for types. You will see loads of exceptions here. Find a selector not found exception, that is this one, click OK. That's it. So now we can take this up here, we can cut it here, we can paste it in down here as it belongs. So up here it takes all the general exceptions, nothing will really happen. We could add in a log message, say just general exception 1 and then just general exception. So we can specify it down here. Here we know that we have problems with our selector. So now we can specify this further. An error occurred with the selector like this. That's it. It's important to state that this selector not found exception is simply just a subset of the system exceptions like we had up here. So when I create robots, I usually just use this up here, unless I have a good reason to. Maybe I want to be very specific because I need that in my log, either for error handling or for talking to the business. Now let's look at the other kinds of exception, because we have the system exception, which this selector not found is a subset of. We have the other kind, that is business rule exceptions. That is when, for instance, something is wrong with our data, the range is bad. Usually it's simply just because some data is missing or is invalid. In our case, let's move to the Excel sheet. Say that one of the transactions, we can have this one here, that was an A, like this. So now you can see we can press 2, 4, but we can't press an A on the calculator. So let's save it and let's try to encounter for that. Because if we run here, let me have the calculator open. So find it and open it. So if we run it, 2, 4, and then we will try to have the 6, it can't, and the robot is finished. But let me show you the log here. Here we only have 1. And now again, we have an exception occurred with the selector. You can argue that it is an error with the selector, but it was an error caused by invalid data here. So how do we do that? Well, I want to check if we have something in our data that is not a number. That means that we can type it in on our calculator. Let me show you. So up here, we will have before this one here, we will have an if where we will ask, is the current row, is that transaction, is that a number? And to do so, search for an if and drag it in here. Like this. So here we will just take the number from the transactions and try to parse it as a number. To do so, we can take the Double.TryParse. This will just take a string and try to parse it to a double. That means convert it to a double. And let me show you here. This can work for this one, works for this one, but it won't work for this one. So let's go over here. Then we will have the parentheses. The input string, that was just the number that we used down here as well. You remember we created a variable for that. That was this one, strNumber. So put in strNumber here. You can press Control Space to finish it. That is the IntelliSense, like this. Then we'll have a comma. Now we need to have a test variable for the double. So go down to variables, create a new variable. I'll just call this double.Test, dblTest, like this. The variable type, that will be a double. So click the drop down here, browse for types, take the double. Scroll a little bit down to MS Collib here, system double, click OK. Now we have a double, that's fine. We can use that up here. So here we will just say Control Space again, dblTest, like this. So this one here will try to take whatever we have in the transaction column. It will try to parse it, that means convert it to a double. If that is true, well, that's fine. That is a number, we can use it here. But say that we have an error, then we will go over here. That means that we have invalid data in our transactions. We want to tell the business side that we have an error here. To do so, we will use a throw. So a throw can be used to manually throw exceptions. Remember here, when it couldn't find a number, it automatically threw that exception here. But here, we will just say, is this not true? That means that there's not a number here. Then we will throw an exception. And you will see that we cannot fill anything in here. So go over to properties, click the 3 dots here. Here we can define what kind of exception you want to throw. I'll say new, and then we will have to type in the exception. I will have the business rule exception here, like this, then a parentheses and 2 quotation marks. So here we can give it a message. I want to include the transaction ID into this message, but because imagine that we have 10,000 transactions rows in our Excel sheet, then it will be very hard to locate that transaction if we haven't got an ID. So always try to have an ID so you can refer to it. Here it's very easy, we have 4 rows, I know, but we will use it. So we will use the ID column here. So go back here. So here we can say transaction item no, and then space, then outside the quotation mark make a space more, say plus, then we will have the idea. To get the idea, remember we are still in the for each row, so we will refer to the current row, row.Item, parentheses, quotation marks, ID, then another quotation mark, parentheses end, then to string like this, and now we will have some more text. So have space more, plus, space, and quotation mark end. This one will be blank. So now we will say transaction item number. We have the number here. We could just say couldn't be processed due to invalid input data. Again, you could be more specific if you want in your robot. We will stick with this because now let's see what happened. We have this invalid transaction here. We have the calculator open as well. That's fine. Let's reset it. Let's try to run the robot. So 2, 4, 8. It misses the 6. Robot is finished. That's fine. And now we just need to catch this new kind of exception. That was the business rule exception. We need to catch it down here. Otherwise, it will look here. It will look where do I belong? It will go into the exception. That will be this one as a general exception. Let's try to run it and see that it's actually doing what I say. So we are running it. It will say 2, 4, 8, robot is finished, and we can check the log. So go down to output. Here you'll say general exception. Doesn't say much. We want to have our nice business rule exception and the message. So we created it up here. Go down to the catch and add a new catch. So the exception, that is a business rule exception. You have to click browse for types. Business rule exception, click OK, like this. Then we will add a log message to it. So in the activity, find a log message. I'll just drag it in from the reasons, drag it in. Here, on my log level, that will just be an info because this is invalid input data. It happens all the time, so this will just be an info, not a warn. The message, well, we already created the message up here. There's no reason to add to it unless you have to, because then we can have more business rule exceptions inside our try. Say that we have more activities, then we can have different messages. So we'll simply just say exception like this, then message here. Let's try to run our robot again. So I'll click run file. It will say 248 again, 248, robot is finished. Click OK. If we go down to output, we can see here transaction item number 3. Okay, we missed a space. Couldn't be processed due to invalid input data. Bingo, we now have created a good log. Our robot will still run even though it encountered this error. The try catch is the building block in most of our automations, especially in the UiPath framework, which is our framework for scaling our robots. If you don't master it, you should learn it right now, as it is used in all companies. Click the video here on the screen. That will take you directly to the 1-hour framework tutorial.